These two countries have long traditions of liberal democracy, and both are representative democracies, meaning we elect people to make decisions about laws on our behalf. But Canada and the United States do have differences in how these systems work. And it starts right at the top. One is led by a president, the other a prime minister. Well, kinda. It's also kinda the Queen or King of England, but also not really. It's complicated. Let's break it down. For starters, the systems differ, where the United States is a republic, and Canada is a constitutional monarchy using the Westminster Parliamentary system. Let's unpack these ideas. Starting at the top, we'll look at the heads of state of these two countries. This is the person who personifies the legitimacy of the state. And this is where we have our first major difference. In the United States, the head of state is the president and is elected directly by the American people. Okay, so there's also an electoral college system that goes into electing the president, so it's a little bit more complicated than directly by the people, but close enough for this video. In Canada, the person ultimately in charge is actually the British Crown. However, the King or Queen in Canada has a much more ceremonial role. In fact, they don't make that cross-Atlantic trip very often, and so in Canada are represented by a position known as the Governor General. They need to sign off on or give royal assent to every new law, but because of their unelected position, they'll sign any piece of paper that comes across their desk. If they didn't, we'd have a pretty major constitutional crisis on our hands. They also have the power to dissolve government and call new elections, which again is largely ceremonial. Typically, the Governor General will always grant the request of a Prime Minister to dissolve Parliament and have new elections. One time, in 1926, the Governor General actually refused this request from the Prime Minister, and it became one of the biggest scandals in the history of the Canadian government. Needless to say, no Governor General has tried it since. Now, in the United States, because the President is elected, they have considerably more power. Like in Canada, the head of state, the President, has to sign off on new laws. But in the United States, the President has the right to refuse, and actually does so quite often. This power is often referred to as the presidential veto. The president is also commander-in-chief of the US military, has the power to appoint cabinet ministers, nominate Supreme Court justices, and, with support of the US Secretary of State, represents the United States in foreign affairs. So the closest position in Canada is in fact the Prime Minister, but has slightly reduced powers. And we refer to the Prime Minister not as head of state because that's the Governor General / the monarch, so we refer to them as the head of government. Unlike the United States, the Prime Minister isn't directly elected, but is instead the leader of the political party that wins the most seats in Parliament. Right? So the only time you would actually directly vote for the person who might become Prime Minister is if you live in their constituency on election day. They hold some similar roles to that of the US President, such as appointing members of the cabinet and Supreme Court judges, as well as representing Canada internationally. Their power is comparatively limited, however, because they don't have, for example, that power of veto. But because they'll always be the leader of the party that's in power, it wouldn't necessarily be that practical of a power anyway, since all new laws are going to come from their party anyway. In terms of making laws, the United States, as a republic, has elected officials at every step of the lawmaking process. This process requires a bill pass votes in two chambers, the House of Representatives and the Senate, which together form what's called Congress. In the House of Representatives, districts are divided by population. So states with a higher population can potentially have way more Congress people than states with a lower population. With the Senate, each state has 2 senators, which are elected to 6-year terms, right? So a populous state like California has 2 senators, and a less populated state like Wyoming will also have 2 senators. And this is meant to give some more equal regional voice throughout the United States, right? So when a bill successfully passes a vote in both houses in Congress, it then goes on to the president, who needs to sign it to turn it into a law. Or, like I said before, sometimes they won't sign it, and then it won't become a law. So all that work through both the House and the Senate might be for naught if the president decides to veto a law. Lately, this has led to some issues. If the House and Senate are controlled by two different parties, this could lead to some pretty serious gridlock as polarization in the US increases. But also, if both houses are controlled by one party, but the president is of the other party, well then, right, this polarization might lead to also some pretty intense gridlock where the president might not want to sign laws that are created entirely by their opposing party. You can see some of the challenges here in terms of getting anything done. And as you can imagine, there's lots of blame and finger pointing going around, right? So in recent years, this growing polarization has made lawmaking in the United States very difficult. The Westminster system in Canada also has two houses, but their nature and how they work is quite different. The House of Commons, the lower house in Parliament, has a role that's pretty similar to the House of Representatives, where members are elected from ridings or constituencies that are based mostly on population and geography, right? So like in the House, more populous areas like major cities will have more MPs than more rural areas. Unlike in the US, where laws can start from either the House of Representatives or the Senate, the House of Commons is the primary lawmaking body in Canada. The Prime Minister and Cabinet Ministers are all going to be MPs, members of Parliament in the House of Commons. And it's these cabinet members who typically propose the bills that become laws. Other MPs who are not in cabinet can also propose what are called private members' bills, but these don't often get very far in becoming laws, right? And so the House of Commons is where all the major debates about laws happen. The other house, or the upper house in Canada, is also called the Senate, like in the US. But for all you American viewers out there, this is where it gets a little bit crazy. Because in Canada, the Senate and the senators in the Senate are unelected. In fact, they're appointed by the Prime Minister for basically a term for life until they turn 75 years old. The idea here is that senators are to give bills what we call a sober second thought. They look over bills, give expert advice, propose changes, all through a lens that doesn't have to involve thinking about the next election. However, because senators are unelected, any proposed changes have to then also go through a vote in the House of Commons. And similarly to the US, if senators propose changes and then the House of Commons votes positively on those changes, that bill might then end up in front of the Governor General, where it's signed and turned into a law. But really, most of the active process of lawmaking, again, happens in that House of Commons, which is the only part of the Canadian government that is elected. And we call this whole process responsible government. So, as I mentioned before, when elections happen in Canada, the leader of the party that wins the most seats in Parliament becomes the Prime Minister, and their party forms government. And so, because all the action happens in the House of Commons, if a party happens to win more than half of the seats in the House of Commons, we call that a majority government, and they're basically free to pass whatever laws they want. The party with the second most seats is called the official opposition, and it's their job to find gaps in proposed laws, to be critical of the government's actions, and to keep them to account. But because of Canada's multi-party system, sometimes majority governments can be won with only about 35 to 40% of the public's support, right? So you can have a government with basically total control of the government and of the lawmaking process being elected by less than half of Canadians. More often lately, majorities have actually been tough to come by, and we're seeing more minority governments in power. What this means is that the party that forms government actually has less than half of the 338 seats in Parliament, and so needs to find ways to work with other parties in order to get laws passed, which, as you can imagine, can pretty seriously slow down the lawmaking process. So often in a minority situation, whenever a prime minister feels like they're going up in polls and in support to the point where they might be able to win a majority government, they'll pretty much always ask the Governor General for a new election and possibly win that majority, right? So in minority governments, we typically see elections more frequently. Similarly, If in a minority situation, all the other parties feel like the government isn't doing a good job, they can get together and hold what's called a vote of no confidence. And if over half of the MPs in Parliament vote against the government in a vote of no confidence, that will also trigger a new election, right? So in Canada, there's no such thing as a predictable timing for elections. In a majority government, sure, the government will ride out their whole term, but in a minority situation, well, elections can happen anytime. So let's recap. In Canada, the head of state is the British Crown and is represented in Canada by the Governor General. And the head of government is the Prime Minister. In the United States, both roles are filled by the US President, who is directly elected by the American people. The Canadian Prime Minister, on the other hand, comes to power by being the leader of the party who wins the most seats in Parliament and forms government. For a bill to become a law in Canada, it starts in the House of Commons. If passed in the House of Commons, it moves on to the Senate for them to give it that sober second thought. And if the Senate passes it as is, it moves on to the Governor General to give it royal assent and make that bill a law. In the United States, a bill can start from either the House or the Senate, and needs to pass both before the president signs it into law. A president can also exercise their veto power to not sign a bill into law, a power that the Prime Minister in Canada does not have. And the Governor General would never actually exercise that because their position is unelected and ceremonial. Hoo-wee, that feels like a lot of ground to cover. And I'm sure I missed a gazillion different things. But it's been fun. I might have to make more videos to compare these two countries again in the future. If you have any ideas on what to compare next, let me know in the comments below. And hey, if you learned something today, give this video a like, subscribe if you haven't already, ring that notification bell, and we'll see you again next time.